In today's episode, I talk about using dip nibs in fountain pens, how we measure grip diameters here at Goulet Pens, and Lamy extra fine nib availability. Hey everybody, Brian Goulet here of gouletpens.com, and today is episode number 170 of Goulet Q&A. Had a good weekend this past weekend, had the Goulet picnic, lots of Goulet families that were there. It's a lot of kids, a lot of little kids these days. It's really cool to see just how many families are impacted by what we have going on around here, and of course you all are a part of that by watching, sharing, buying from our store. It's all part of it. So that was really, really kind of cool little thing that we got to do. So nice little team building thing. We have had some pretty notable things happening this week. We had Lamy petrol, extra fine. We had a little bit of ink that came in, a little bit of drama surrounding that. This is Wednesday afternoon when I'm shooting this Q&A. We launched it at 1 o'clock. Had some website things going on. We're still sorting it out, so I don't have a good explanation, even though by the time you watch this, it will be 2 days from when that happened, but that was rather eventful today. So as all that stuff was going down, I was like, wow, okay, I have to go shoot a Q&A now. Anyway, but we're getting all that sorted out. No shortage of excitement around that, but we do have a restock of some petrols. Definitely some news on the Lamy extra fine nibs, which came up organically as a Q&A question this week. So I will be talking about that here in a little bit, but there's some news on that. And then kind of with that, a bunch of Lamy things going on right now. We've known for a while that Lamy is changing over from the Z24 to the Z28. And I can touch on that here a little bit. I do have another little short video that's going to be going on that, but I can touch on it here in Q&A. So we've known for a little bit that they were going to switch over to the Z28. There's been some confusion around that, just because not everywhere in the world are they changing the name of the converter to Z28. So there's been some communication stuff around that worldwide, and I think it's up to each region if they're going to choose to change the name or not. I don't know all the details, but I know in the US, we're calling it the Z28. You may see it overseas elsewhere still being called the Z24. There's some slight differences though. And so I'll zoom in real quick just so you can see what those differences are. It's not very significant, but it's worth mentioning to you just because the Z24 is so recognized and has been known so many years. So the Z24 is a little frosty here. It's got a straight tube on the end. It's got kind of a shinier red, and then it's got a black band here, and it's pretty smooth operating action. The Z28, it functions just the same. Dimensions are similar. It snaps in place on the pen just like the Z24 does. It's more of a clear barrel, so that's kind of nice there. It's got a little tapered end, which doesn't really affect anything at all, honestly. And it's got a silver band here. The red is more of a matte finish as opposed to shiny, and I find that it doesn't quite operate as smoothly. I mean, it still operates just fine. It's just a little more effort than this one. So for that reason, I'm assuming we get some people that'll kind of not be super cool with that, but the clear body and stuff. So I don't know. It wasn't really a change we had control over. So I'm just kind of like, well, it is what it is now. But anyway, so that's it. So I just wanted to kind of highlight those things. Same price and everything, but we knew at some point that we would need to make this switch over, and with all of the petrol pens that came back in, we just didn't have enough Z24 converters to be able to see through that launch. So we made the change now. If you are buying a Lamy pen and you're adding a converter, that add-on option will be the Z28 now. We do have a few Z24s still on hand, so you still can buy them separately if you buy it apart from the pen. But any add-on converters you do on our site will be the Z28s now, because the transition is here. Sound good? All right, cool. What else we got? The Aurora Duo carts, we got some of them in. We are sorting some things out with those. We were originally thinking we were going to launch them this week, but we have some things to work back and forth a little bit with Aurora on that. So They're not going to be launching this week, but soon, very soon. And I do have a question about that in Q&A, so I'm going to talk about that here. Leuchtturm some lines a day, so I posted a little bit of stuff on that on my personal Instagram, if you follow me there. So that we're going to have to delay a little bit as well. I swear, it's just like, I don't know what it is. We just have a hard time getting the right amount of stock. So, you know, this is a product that's been available for a while. It just kind of got on our radar. And it's kind of, I think it's just taken Leuchtturm by surprise, the recent upswell of interest in this some lines a day. So we did get some in, but we don't feel confident enough to launch. So we're waiting for them to get another shipment, and it should be another week or so, and then we'll be able to get restocked and then be able to do an adequate launch. We've had so many things that have happened this year where it's just like we get shorted on certain nib sizes with pens with the launch, or just whole, you know, colors get left out like Game of Thrones, and just, you know, it's like, man, we are just really having some stuff going on the logistics side, and we're doing our best to overcome that, but the struggle is real on our end. And then another cool thing that happened just today was got to visit with Mark. He's from Coles of London, the US distributor for Visconti. Always good guy. They support us a lot. They support the brand a lot. So getting some intel on some future Visconti stuff, and he brought with him Roberto, who is the sales manager for Visconti in Italy. So we got to meet him. He's super cool, very passionate, dynamic guy, just as all the Visconti folk are. And it was really cool to build those relationships and get to talk about some you know, businessy things and some, you know, future product development stuff. So lots of exciting stuff to come there. Visconti is definitely not resting on their laurels. They got a lot of cool stuff that's yet to come out that I think you guys will enjoy. But anyway, you'll be hearing more about that soon enough. So let's get into the questions this week, shall we? Kicking it off with some pen and writing ones. First one is from the Ultimate Pixel on YouTube. There are a lot of fancy dip nibs that are super flexible or have 5 lines and stuff like that. Are there any fountain pens that could hold such nibs without the need to always, dip them? The need to always dip them. Or are these nibs just plainly incompatible with regular feeds? Okay, so I get asked this question a lot. My team gets asked this question a lot. Dip nibs, you know, so this is just one example. There's a lot of different dip nibs that are out there. This technology actually precludes fountain pens, right? So the nib technology and things like that, back when they were using, you know, traditionally iron gall inks and just really thick kind of dip calligraphy ink. The concept is you have some sort of nib holder, right? It's just a piece of wood in this instance with a little metal doohickey in the bottom there. You have your nib, which is just made of steel. It's just a coated steel. It's not stainless steel or anything like that. And you just shove it right into the nib holder, and you dip it into your ink, which is a thicker ink than fountain pen ink. And it needs to be thicker because it just kind of hangs on the outside of the nib. And then you write with it. And the nib itself, it operates somewhat similarly. You know, it's got a slit in here, and it's got tines and stuff like that. But some of the more ornamental nibs, like what you're talking about, the really flexible ones, you know, because they can make the steel really soft, they make it really thin, it can get very, very flexible. However, the thing is, these nibs are very cheap, but they do not last a super long time. So they are meant to be more or less disposable. So they're different from fountain pen nibs because fountain pen nibs are made to last years and years and decades. These nibs definitely do not last that long. So you buy them in sets, or you buy packs of them if you're using them a lot, and you use them up until they just are just not functioning anymore, and then you throw them away and you get another one, maybe a couple bucks a piece or something like that. Very different kind of functionality than fountain pen nibs, but because they're more or less disposable, you can get extreme flexibility and crazy stuff like that. Because essentially, if you spring it and ruin it, well, that's okay. You can just grab another one. It's not a high investment like a fountain pen nib. No precious metals or anything like that going on here. This is a set that actually we used to carry years ago, so I just kind of pulled it out. I don't mess around a lot with dip nibs personally. I love fountain pens, and that's kind of my thing, and this is just, I haven't gotten there. But a lot of calligraphers and lettering artists and people that are into hand lettering and stuff like that will get into the dip stuff just because you know, it's relatively inexpensive to invest in some very interesting nibs. And on the flip side, you can get some inks that have some different looks to them. Like for example, you can get pigmented inks, so you can get like gold and white and some other colors that are not possible in a fountain pen because the pigments are too thick to flow through the fountain pen. So you can get the thicker pigmented stuff with a dip pen and you can use it that way. So that's a lot of what you see. A lot of people on Instagram doing this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of crossover too between people that are hand lettering and doing calligraphy stuff and getting into fountain pens and stuff like that. This is not my background personally, but I've dabbled here and there. So I think the spirit behind this is a lot of people are like, well, fountain pens, the great thing about them is their portability, their durability, and the reservoir of the pen. That's why they're called a fountain pen, because it flows out of the pen like a fountain, right? Literally, that's where the name came from. Because before that, back in the early 1900s, before fountain pens really kind of became popular, you had a lot of dip pens. And well, you had quills, and then it got into like kind of dip pens, and you were used to having to dip everything. And then when you didn't have to dip anymore, that became like the new smartphone, right? Like it was that like revolutionary at the time. And so, yeah, that's how fountain pens kind of took off. So to think like, okay, if I want kind of these extreme nib ornamentations and flexibility and stuff like that, but I also want the reservoir, the flowability, and the ink capacity of a fountain pen, why can't I combine the two and make it happen? And I've seen a couple people do it. There's certain types of nibs, like I've heard of the Browse Rose nib, Zebra G has some nibs. I've kind of heard of some of those. The thing about these though, that I'll try to show you here today, again, without having full expertise on the calligraphy stuff, I know enough to be probably dangerous and incorrect in a lot of areas, but if you're looking at the pens this way, the diameter of this opening and this opening is different. Fountain pen nibs, most fountain pen nibs, especially these larger number 6 size pens, which a lot of people like to use for nib swapping and things like that, the diameter is bigger. So what that means is the curvature on the nib is going to be different. So just as an example, I have this Stenofetter nib from Jeroboam, kind of an interesting looking nib, has some flexibility to it. And if I look at it straight on, I'm going to pull out this number 6 nib out of my Jinhao pen. I'm going to flip it around, show you the back. So here's my number 6 Jinhao, here's my Stenofetter, and the curvature is very different, especially if I put them on top of each other. Should I zoom in even more? Let's go extreme here. Zooming in. I'm looking at my monitor over here, that's why I'm glancing away from the screen. So if you look straight at them, you can see the curvature is different. There, that's a little better. You can see there's more of an extreme curve on the dip nib, a more gentle curve on the Jinhao. So what that means is if I go and try to take a Jinhao nib and stick it into a nib holder, well, it's gonna really not fit great. And when I try and fit my Stenofetter nib on my fountain pen feed, look at all that extra space there. That is not how it's supposed to fit. It's gonna need to fit more like this. So when you have a fountain pen nib, look how closely that fits on there. There's no extra space, right? Because it's made to fit around that feed. So this is what you run into, is the curvature is very different. So in order to make it fit, which is literally what you have to do, you have to like press and squeeze and get it on there. And you have to literally kind of like bend the metal to fit around the feed and then cram it into your pen. And sometimes, depending on what kind of metal that's used or whatever, the thickness of the actual nib metal itself may be different than what's used on a fountain pen nib. So even if you get the right curvature, it may be too loose or too tight, depending on how much space you have in here. Because the thing about fountain pens is they need a very proper amount of air-ink interchange in order to flow properly. Yes, you can cram any nib into any pen if you are daring enough to try, but it's not necessarily going to flow properly and consistently because they're designed to have a very certain balance between how much air is going into the pen as the ink is flowing out of it. And if it's out of balance, it's either going to be too dry or too wet. You don't have any of those considerations when you're dealing with a dip nib because there's no airflow that matters. All you're doing is dipping the nib on here. It's kind of dripping down and flowing down as you write. And then you dip it again and dip it again and dip it again and just keep on going. But fountain pens have a little more technology, a little more engineering involved in making them flow. So what ends up happening, I'm having a point to all this, is when you're using dip nibs in fountain pens, you can make them work, but almost always you're going to end up with some kind of compromise of ink flow. It's either going to be too dry or it's going to be too wet, or you're going to end up with some kind of situation where you're going to have trade-offs. And it's always going to have to be a bit of a battle to kind of force it in there if it's going to fit properly at all. So that's kind of where I'm at. It can be done. It's a bit of a hack though. I've seen other people do it and you can get some extreme flexibility. Usually it comes at the expense of being able to flow well and it can be a little frustrating, but it's something you can experiment with, especially if something like a Jinhao or a Noodler's Ahab or something like that. It's not a huge investment, and then to get dip nibs are relatively cheap too. It is only certain types of nibs that will even work at all though. If you're looking at something like the one you talked about here that's got the 5 lines, that's called a music nib, that is not going to flow because that really isn't made. There's nothing in the design of the nib that's made to draw ink from the back of the nib to the tines. It's really just made to be dipped. So only certain only certain dip nib designs will even begin to function like a fountain pen nib. And as I'm looking at it, this Steno Fetter one is not even one that probably would work at all because it's got this big ridge in the middle of it. So it probably wouldn't even work. So that's a terrible example of one to show you, but I wanted to show you because it was similar in size to that number 6 nib. But that's what's going on with those. It can be fun to kind of experiment a little bit, but it's definitely a hack. Cool. All right. This next question is from Molindela on Instagram. How do you measure grip diameter on your site? Most grip sections are tapered, some flare out a bit at the end, etc. Okay, so I'm going to take this question, even expand upon it a little bit, but the first thing I'm going to say is it is a bit of a judgment call because the way that we have the grip diameter on our site, it's this one number. But if you look at a pen like I don't know, Lamy 2000, where is the grip on this pen? Just looking at it, tell me, where is the grip? Well, it's kind of this whole area here, and this area is a lot fatter than this area. So do I put a range of the grip or whatever? I don't know. We kind of need a place to determine what is the grip diameter. So it has to be a judgment call a little bit. Take another pen for an example. You have a Edison Nouveau Premier. This one is in the no longer available Autumn Harvest because you know I love to show you pens that you can't have in Q&A. Well, this one's got a nice taper. So is the grip diameter the end or is it in the middle or what? So really what we did when we started doing grip dimensions on our site, we gave it a lot of thought. We talked to our team, and I think what we determined was we're going to measure the grip at the place that we feel most people would actually be holding the pen. Now, everybody's got a different grip, I'll give you that. But for example, a Lamy 2000, are most people gripping the pen all the way at the end? No, probably not. Are they gripping it all the way back here? Probably not. They're probably gripping it right around here somewhere. So we had a bunch of people kind of hold the pen and like, where are we pretty much agreeing that this is about the point where people would most likely be holding the pen, and we measure it there. So it's right about in this area here somewhere. And then I take some digital calipers, measure it very precisely, and there's your grip measurement. Is there a better way to do it? Probably, but that's how we did it. Now, the question that we get a lot is, what about the Visconti traveling ink pot or the traveling inkwell, whichever it's called? I like to say inkwell. I prefer that name, but it says ink pot. It's mixed in their own marketing materials. But anyway, so if you look at, pens like, let's see here, what have I got? The Pilot Metropolitan. Well, it's got a nice taper with a flare at the end of it. So first off, where is the grip measurement anyway? But you get into something like this with a traveling ink pot. It's like, is this going to fit in the ink pot? Well, yes, it will up to the flare, but then if you push it a little bit, it goes past the rubber and will then not fit until you push it even further and it gets tighter up on the grip. So even certain pens like that, it's like if you just look at the grip diameter, will it fit on the traveling inkwell? Well, even that can be a little bit sticky. So one initiative that we're going to do here in a little bit, we're going to have save up some bandwidth on with some of my team, and they're going to go through and they're going to test every pen and see if it fits properly into the traveling inkwell. So that's a determination that we're going to make. So that's going to be a bit of an undertaking, a bit of a project, but it is going to be forthcoming, we hope. So certain things like that, that's a context of a lot of, I know that you didn't specifically ask about that, but that is one situation where we do get asked a lot about grip diameters, is that traveling inkwell. So, but yes, so just to give you some kind of general ideas, there's a couple of different types of grips that we run into. When you have a heavy taper, like a Lamy 2000, I really kind of just pick a point in there and say, I'm going to determine that this is really where the grip is. And so that's the measurement that we use. Anything with a taper, like the Premier, pretty much pick the low point in the middle, because that's, again, where you're pretty much going to be gripping it. That's the grip. Something like a Noodler's Ahab is kind of weird because it's got a fat part of the grip and then it kind of cuts down right in the middle. So that one's kind of a tough judgment call. But we, again, just kind of picked where we thought people would grip it, and that's what we chose. And then you have something that has a flare on the end of it, like the Pilot Metropolitan. We don't measure the flare as the grip because nobody's actually grabbing right onto that flare. Again, it's kind of that low point in here before the flare that your fingers are going to kind of be up against. So somewhat subjective, but we felt that it was at least something. So if you've got any better feedback, I'm all ears. Love to hear what you have to say. Cool. All right. Next question is from Pro Echo 12 on Instagram. I have this really burning question about how many fountain pen deaths or accidents have occurred. Well, in general, I have no idea. There's no governmental statistic on how many fountain pens die every year. I personally have never ruined a pen by dropping it on the floor. I think that's more what you're talking about. I've intentionally destroyed nibs before when I'm practicing nib tuning and stuff like that to try to then fix them, but I don't really count that. I've honestly never damaged a nib beyond its accepted use in the 7.5 years, 8 years that I've been using fountain pens. So, and I've handled a lot of pens, so maybe I'm just really, really lucky, but I definitely hear I've had my own team members and lots of customers that have dropped pens, and of course, when you drop a pen, it always goes nib down. I've actually dropped a number of pens and never landed one nib down. Knock on wood, right? So, that said, I'm gonna go and do that like immediately after this Q&A, maybe even during the Q&A, you just watch. But I've been very fortunate in that way. So I would say that if that's a concern for you, then maybe you wanna stick with pens that have replaceable nibs. Something like, Lamy, you can swap those nibs. If you want to invest in nicer pens, Edison has replaceable nib units. There's several brands, Monteverde, Conklin, they've got replaceable nibs. Anything with a number 6 nib is replaceable. You can get a Goulet Nib or a Noodler's Nib. Noodler's flexible nibs and the Noodler's Conrad or Ahab. So you definitely have some options. I would kind of steer you in those directions if you are concerned about death accident things with pens. I've had a couple of pens. Okay, so I'm talking really about nibs, but you asked a broader question now that I reread it about the whole pen. I have had a couple of pens that have kind of like fallen apart or that I've broken by dropping it harshly or something like that. A couple of Noodler's Preppies just over the years handling them, it's cracked. That's not anything too surprising. And then I had some like old Pelicano Juniors, like the old style from 8 years ago or so, 7 years ago, that have broke, like the grip the grip has broken and stuff like that. I haven't had any TWSBIs crack on me, thank goodness. I've had some that have a little slivers, but nothing that's affected the function of it ever. And then I've had, just other things where I might have, I had my Keras Customs where I threw it across the parking lot. That scarred it a little bit, but it didn't die. No, I've had a really, really good fortune with the death thing. So, last thing I'm going to say is if you have any pens where you do drop it on the nib, it may not be gone. You can usually get that repaired by a Nibmeister for a somewhat reasonable charge, depending on how bad it is. Look into that. If it's a pen that, you can't replace the nib and it's still worth investing in a little bit, you can get it tuned by a pro. All right, I'm very thirsty. So give me a second, I'm gonna drink some water. Andrew W. on Facebook asks, will the new Duo Cart from Aurora be able to hold 2 cartridges inside the barrel like the original, hence the name Duo Cart? That is how the name came to be. This is a relaunch, a relaunch of the original Aurora Duo Cart pen, which is maybe 50 years old or so. I have not seen the original pen in my own hands for myself, but that is what I'm told from Aurora. So if you open up the pen, it's a cartridge converter pen. You see there's a cavity in there, and you can put cartridges in there. The thing is, Aurora's changed the design of their cartridges since then. So now they have these super long cartridges. If you were to try to fit 2 of these cartridges in any pen, it would be like this long. So no, you cannot put 2 cartridges, 2 modern Aurora cartridges in the Aurora Duo Cart of today. They have changed the design of both the pen and the cartridge since the original. So now it's not really the Duo Cart functionality that is the selling point of the pen. They just use the name because they found inspiration from their own original design of the pen. But the dual cartridge thing is not a part of that. Nor is it really necessary because this is a super cartridge. It holds a pretty good amount of ink, so you don't really need 2 cartridges. You just have one long one. So, but that's a good question, and that is where the name comes from, is originally it did hold 2 cartridges inside the pen, which you can still do on many modern standard international pens, like the Jinhao, for example. You can do that. So if you want to kind of have one cartridge installed and the other one as a backup, you can do that. Or you can get a standard international long cartridge, which is about the size of the Aurora cartridge, and go about it that way too. All right, I got a couple of troubleshooting questions. First one is from Ginger O on Facebook. Why does my fountain pen make such loud scratching noise when I write? Well, I don't know what you consider to be a loud scratching noise. I've heard some loud and I've heard some really loud. So usually when the pen is making an audible, scratchy sound, it's because the nib tines are out of alignment. So what happens, the way these nibs are designed, is if you're looking straight at the pen, you have your 2 tines of your nib with the iridium tip at the end, and you have the tines, which are supposed to be aligned like this, and then it writes nice and smoothly. Ooh, yes, feels good. If they're out of alignment like that, then it's gonna write smoothly in one direction, and in the other direction, it's gonna drag, and it's gonna hurt. It's gonna hurt your soul to have that thing dragging on there. So a lot of times, just properly aligning those tines will fix that, or at least greatly diminish, especially the audible noise of the scratchiness. So I think if it's that obvious, like the louder you're hearing a scratch, that's probably an indication of the worse that it is, which means you're probably even gonna see some sort of indentation or impression on the paper, maybe even literally scratching or cutting the paper. So you can see even little paper fibers kind of torn up. You might get some paper fibers that get torn up and get jammed up into your nib, which can then cause flow problems in one direction or another. I've had pens where I've had scratchiness that has torn up the paper fiber, and it kind of jams the paper fiber up into the end and kind of turns it into like a felt tip pen. So it starts to write really wet and like broad. It like immediately goes up 3 nib sizes because I've got all these paper fibers kind of jammed up in the edge of the tip. It spreads the tines apart, increases the flow, and it makes it write like a big Sharpie almost. You know, so that's something you got to watch out for. That, or stuff can get crammed up in there, kind of jam it up and then stop the flow. So one of the two. But that's usually what you have going on there. Properly aligning them can help a lot. Sometimes scratchiness is because it's just not smoothed properly, and it needs to be smooth on something like micro mesh or mylar paper, and you run into some of that stuff. So it could be something like that. Or it could be due to just your own kind of writing angle or rotation or pressure. Sometimes what I see from pens that people are saying are scratchy is really just a matter of their own use of it. Oftentimes it's if their nib size is finer than what they're really going for. So one thing that you can do to increase the flow of your nib is to press harder. It's kind of a short-lived thing because you could ruin the nib or, you know, do a bunch of other crazy things with it. But your natural instinct, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with fountain pens, can be to bear down if you feel like the ink is not coming out heavy enough, because, you know, using whatever, gel roller balls, ballpoint, things like that, it can be our natural instinct to either swirl or write harder or scratch harder or something like that if it's not writing properly. Well, you can do that with a fountain pen, but you might throw the nib out of alignment, you might cause the tines to splay or bend or something like that, and that can definitely increase that scratchiness problem. So you want to make sure you're writing properly. Really, you only need, for a properly tuned fountain pen, you only need pretty much the weight of the pen itself in order for the ink to be able to flow out of it. So you should never really be pressing down onto the pen. Otherwise, you're risking making your pen feel scratchier by knocking those tines out of alignment. It could be due to your own writing angle. Some nibs are ground in such a way that they write, you know, better when they're a little bit lower or a little bit higher. A lot of the Japanese pen companies grind them because they hold their pens slightly more upright. So that's the more natural position. A lot of European pens are ground so that it's held lower. It's kind of the way they do it. But a lot of pens, if you hold them very upright, can be really scratchy. So if you're used to holding your pen really upright, that can feel scratchy, and you really just need to drop your angle down. So that's something you can try out. Or sometimes it could be the rotation of the pen in your hand. So really you want the nib surface pointing straight up. And I've definitely seen this sometimes where the ink flow can be affected, or the scratchiness feeling can be affected by over-rotation, especially if you combine it with pressing down too hard. If you're rotating the nib too much in one direction and then you're pressing too hard, then you're causing that to happen with your nib tines instead of this. If you're over-rotating, you're doing that, and then doing that enough, it's going to then make your nib get all kinds of scratchy and stuff like that. So that can be a behavioral use kind of thing that you can watch out for. And I especially see that happen when people are writing and certain words, or when you get to a certain part of the page, you can actually twist the pen in your fingers as you're writing, and you may not even realize it. You may set it properly in your hand, and then you start writing, and you're just immediately going like that. Sort of like if you're, you know, if you have a golf swing and you're setting your golf club, and it looks great when you're sitting there, but then when you actually go to do the swing, you realize you're like twisting your hands and completely slicing the ball. It's the same kind of thing when you get into fountain pens. Like, okay, I've got it set here, and then when you start writing, you're immediately twisting the thing hardcore in your hand. So that's just something to kind of watch out for yourself. So with all these little bits and pieces, you can just try all these different things. And then to go back to my thought that I'd started earlier, one of the things is if your nib size is too small, you can have a tendency to write with more pressure to try to get it to write broader. The other thing is if your ink color is not as saturated as you would want it to be, you can have a tendency to press harder to get more of the ink to come down and make it darker. A good example, the very, very first ink that I ever used in a fountain pen was Diamine China Blue. And it's a very kind of just light royal blue. And it looks like, well, like China, like a China blue. I really wanted a deep blue because that's my thing, right? So I was trying to constantly press and make that ink into something that it wasn't. It was always more watered down and a weaker, lighter blue than what I really wanted. It wasn't until I then got a darker blue. Actually, when I bought it at a pen show, the DC pen show in 2009, that was my first bottle of ink I ever bought. So I bought an 80 ml bottle of China blue. And with that, the retailer who's no longer around that I bought it from gave me a 30 ml bottle of Midnight, which is a much darker blue. So I used the China blue first, and I was like, I was amazed, like, oh my gosh, this flows so great. And after I used it for a bit, I was like, oh, I really don't like this blue that much. So then I used the Midnight after that, and I was like, oh. And then I found I lightened the pressure up a lot after I did that. I was really just naturally wanting a darker color. So I was writing harder and pressing harder with the lighter color because I was really trying to get a darker color. So that can be something to watch out for yourself. So there's all kinds of fun things to learn and get into when you're learning about these fountain pens. But this is all just knowledge for your brain. You know, rattle it around in there and you can have some fun, experience all these different things. But see, you didn't know you would learn about ink saturation and how it affects your writing pressure when you're asking a question about loud scratching noises. So you never know what nuggets of wisdom you're gonna get out of a Q&A. I have to laugh at myself even saying that phrase, but anyway, I hope you're enjoying this. I'm getting a kick out of it. All right, this question is from Dongzifi on Twitter. Any idea about how to solve a wobbling nib after a swap? Haven't decided to buy a Goulet nib yet for many previous wobble experience. Okay, where do I go with this one? All right, so I have a couple of different pens. I don't know exactly what your definition of wobbling is, so I'm gonna have to interpret it for myself. I think a lot of times there's an interpretation involved when you're talking about wobbling. So I wanna show you some of what's normal. See if maybe this helps narrow it down for you. So I have a Jinhao, and it's got a nib in the pen because it's a fountain pen. Wow, that's such an obvious statement. Okay, so if I look at the back here, now if I take and I move the nib, I can move it back and forth like so. That seems to be kind of wobbly to me, right? But it's pretty well set in there. Like if I'm writing with this thing, I can get it to wobble if I'm writing with some pressure and rotating it a bit. But if I'm writing with it with a light hand, just the weight of the pen, and it's going, it's not gonna wobble. So sometimes you run into that. Now I have had some Lamy pens before, or other pens that have, you know, kind of these intentionally swappable nibs. So these ones are they're designed a little bit different. So they have wings on them that fit kind of over top of the feed instead of inside the pen. You know, like the Jinhao, it fits in the pen, like so, and it pressure fits in there. The Lamy is pressure fit kind of around the feed. So it's a different style, it's a different design. This I tend to hear more about wobbling because what happens is these wings here, they're not very thick. You know, it has these tiny little wings, and if you're swapping your nibs a lot, or if you aren't able to swap it easily and you cram it on there and you can bend the plastic a little bit on those wings, it can cause the nib to then want to wobble just a little bit. I don't hear about this happening a lot, but I know it certainly happens with Lamy nibs and Lamy pens. So that can be something that I hear about. But you know, again, you're talking about a Goulet nib which doesn't fit on the Lamy. So I'm just going to assume that you're talking about a pen like this, or maybe, you know, I've got a Needler's Ahab, which also fits a Goulet nib. This one, you know, can wobble a little bit too, not a huge amount though. But anything where it's friction fit inside there, you're gonna have a tendency to be able to wobble it just a little bit. So I'll pull this one out. You know, it's just friction fit inside of here. So there can be a little bit of rotation. The Ahab's maybe not so bad. The Conrad used to be worse. They've been redesigned since a bit, but the Conrad and I didn't grab one, so I'll have to just kind of talk you through it. But the Conrad just used to be an opening, just a wide opening, so you could actually twist the nib and you could do it in any kind of direction there. And there's definitely some pens where you can still do that. The Ahab here has a little cutout, and I have the clear one. It has a little cutout you can see there where it's got a little line that nib actually kind of fits in. So it's not as much of a tendency to have that nib kind of slide around inside that grip section. So it'll kind of fit in there, and I grabbed the Goulet Nib just so I can show you kind of how that works. But I'll swap it on an Ahab and on a Jinhao. So if I have the feed kind of in here, got that breather tube going on, I can just take the nib and just slide it right in place. You really should install them both together. I'm trying to save time. There we go. So it fits right in there just like the nib, and I'm using a two-tone one just to kind of show it easier. There's my feed. And it's going to move a little bit, but it shouldn't be too bad. It shouldn't be anything that would affect your writing. Doing the same kind of thing on a Jinhao. Take that out. Again, it's a number 6 size nib. Pretty breezy. Easy breezy. Slap it right in there. It kind of sets in. This one's pretty straightforward because, again, it's got kind of a specific direction that it needs to set. And voila. So that's it. And it's not too wobbly. I mean, it'll move back and forth a little bit, just like the Jinhao nib installed in there did. But, you know, I'm going to extremes here, pushing it side to side to get that. When I'm actually writing with it, I mean, it's such a little pressure that I'm putting on it, and it's not going to affect it too much. So I wouldn't be too afraid of it. Go ahead and give it a try. Of course, I would say that, so I can sell you a nib, right? But no, seriously, give it a try. All right. I'm gonna sort that out later. I have one more question to get through today. My big teaser that I had in the intro. This is a business question from kittytoug on Instagram. I recently read on another distributor's blog that Lamy was doing away with extra fine nibs on Safari and All-Star. What have you heard about this? Would it be still possible to purchase extra fine nibs separately, or would they disappear from the fountain pen landscape for good? Would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so I took this question partly because there's a little bit of misinformation even in your question, from what I understand, and I've read all kinds of craziness that has happened because, of course, when anything like this happens, it gets rather dramatic, and you can run away with different rumors and things like that. Also, there has not been like an officially drafted public statement for us as an authorized retailer to give out to you. We did receive kind of an official email through our distributor, through our US distributor, but it was not intended for public, display. So I am reinterpreting this information and sharing it with you henceforth. So first thing I'll do is I'll point to a blog post that we published on Wednesday, this past Wednesday, which actually it's publishing like right now as I'm shooting this. So I'm hoping by the time this video is published on Friday that it actually has published. But anyway, we have, or will have very shortly, a Lamy Extra Fine Nib explanation blog post that will kind of get into details about all this. So it's our understanding that it's not actually that they're discontinuing the Extra Fine Nibs. Here's the whole deal. So you mentioned the Safari and the All-Star and all stuff. It's all extra fine steel nibs. It has nothing to do with specifically with the All-Star, Safari, or anything like that. It purely has to do with a capacity issue for them to produce their extra fine nibs. There's been some speculation that, oh no, is Lamy in trouble? Are they, not able to, is there no demand for extra fine nibs? No, that's not it. There's a lot of demand for extra fine nibs. Too much demand, in fact. And they are prioritizing their stock to Germany and Asia. The Asian market's exploding for Lamy, and that's where they're putting their, Lamy in Germany is putting their efforts there. So in all other areas, they're getting less priority. So that's why we're seeing all of the extra fine nibs, steel nibs, going to Germany and Asia for the foreseeable future. I don't know if it's going to be a permanent thing. I would like to hope that they would increase their production. It's to me, as a business person, it would make sense to me to say, okay, you've got all these people all over the world that love your brand, that love your products, that want their extra fine nibs. Why are you taking them away? You know, so to me, I would suspect probably demand is exploding. They have their priority about, for whatever reason, I'm not privy to that. They have their priority about where they want to put their nibs right now. And maybe they're looking into a way to increase their production. And then when they do, they would then release it to the rest of the world again. I would hope. That has not been communicated to me that is absolutely going to happen. I literally don't have any information more than they're taking the extra fine steel nibs and prioritizing them all to Germany and Asia. So the US market and other parts of Europe and basically everywhere else in the world is not going to be getting extra fine steel nibs on any pens or in spare nibs, because it's the lack of nibs that's the problem. So that's just something that we have to live with. So we got notified of that late last week, and basically we got notified from our distributor, and it was kind of like, well, this is happening right now. So if you want any more extra fine nibs, order up, because we're not getting any more. And that was really kind of it. That's not super uncommon, honestly, for that to happen for us with a lot of different brands. Is kind of like, well, these aren't being made anymore, so this is it. Go ahead and order up, and then they're gone. You know, that's just it. For a variety of reasons, a lot of different brands will do that, but I know from your perspective as a customer, it's kind of like, what the heck? Why is this happening? So, but that's it. So it's affecting the extra fines, all of the steel nibs. So Safari, All-Star, the Luxe too, even though it's a different nib, it's still steel nib. It's still affecting that. So the extra fines on those. So we have ordered up on them. So we are, as we could, but there's certain pens, that were already out, and we just were not able to stock up. So you're going to see certain pens kind of dropping off here and there. We tried to order up as much as we could to last us as long as possible. So for the next several, hopefully through the later part of 2017. But it all depends on how quickly everybody starts gobbling them up once they know that they're not going to be as readily available anymore. It's really hard to tell. Or a bunch of people could be like, forget this, I'm just going to go get another pen or another nib size or whatever. So it's really hard for us to gauge how long it's going to last, but we have ordered up to try to meet demand as much as possible. We're pretty bummed about it. They're not going away forever. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes finally. Is it still possible to purchase the extra fine nibs separately? No. Would they disappear from the fountain pen landscape for good? I doubt it, but they're just going to be harder to come by for the foreseeable future. The thing I will say is that the extra fine and the fine are not drastically different from each other. The Lamy extra fine steel nibs are among the broader of the extra fine nibs that are out there. So if you're, and honestly, like, the extra fine, it was like borderline our most popular nib size. The fine was right next to it. So I think a lot of you would be really pretty happy just switching to a fine. Honestly, a lot of the complaints that I'd heard about the extra fine nibs was how they were somewhat inconsistent, and sometimes they would be just as broad as a fine nib, and things like that. So not so much an issue at this point, but that's it. So that's pretty much what I got on the issue at the moment. So, if you want extra fine nibs, get them now. All right. Question of the week for this week has nothing to do with anything that I've talked about in Q&A today, but I will give you a nice little fun question to pontificate and reflect upon, and then hopefully post in the comments, because it's kind of fun to read each other's things. My question of the week is, if you could go back in time to talk to yourself on the first day that you discovered fountain pens, knowing everything that you know now, what advice would you give to yourself? I think that's kind of a fun hypothetical for you. I'll go ahead and answer the question. I didn't reflect very deeply on it, but I would probably tell myself to explore a lot of different nib sizes. When I first got into fountain pens, I pretty much stuck with stubs. and broads, and I really didn't enjoy extra fines or anything like that. I was pretty narrow in my pen usage at first. I think I would have benefited from really expanding my own experience in those early days, and I would have really enjoyed them. It took me a good number of years, probably 3 or 4 years, before I really started to appreciate all nib sizes. So yeah, not a huge detrimental thing in my book, and I really don't regret anything because I'm very happy where I am in my fountain pen journey. But yeah, that's what I would do. I would talk to myself and say, loosen up a little bit, try some different stuff. Cool. Hope you enjoyed this Q&A. If you liked anything that I talked about here today, you can check it out on gouletpens.com. Be sure to subscribe, all that good stuff. Hopefully I was able to help you out here today. Thanks so much for watching, and right on.